Dvarskas with us talking today. His office is over by Kamazima's somewhere, right?
Where's Kamazima?
Anthony has his doctorate in marine, estuary, and environmental studies from the University of Maryland. But that's only the start of it. He's worked at Woods Hole Institution, at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, at the Regional Center for Central and Eastern Europe, the World's Resources Institute, and at NOAA, the Office of Response and Restoration, and most recently at the United Nations in Environmental and Economic Accounts section. An impressive array of experiences before you here. And he's going to talk to us today about connecting ecosystem conditions with economic values. Anthony, it's all yours.
Okay.
So should that be plural or condition or conditions?
Condition. Okay, so hello everyone. So what I wanted to do was just go over a little bit of the kind of stuff that I do, because I think kind of takes things from a slightly different perspective than what a lot of you maybe have been looking at. And the kind of work that I've worked on is trying to figure out how you end up using measures of ecosystem condition or characteristics of the ecosystem that make up ecosystem condition to lead to a value in typically in dollar terms that we can use for making decisions. So what's the outline going to be? We're going to talk about what the motivating challenge is for doing this work, what we kind of are thinking about for ecosystem condition, what are ecosystem services, which is a term some of you have probably heard bandied about, economic values and ideas of economic value, and then some examples of where I've done some work looking at how you link those ecological and economic measures together. So the first challenge is that a lot of policy decisions, as you all are aware, are based on weighing costs and benefits in dollar terms. And something might be permitting industrial development in an area, right? You might be able to easily quantify what the benefits are in terms of jobs created, money that comes into an area that then supports other businesses, but it's harder to make sure that you're fully incorporating all the costs for development that are being imposed by the loss of environmental services or ecosystem services in an area. And the problem is that a lot of environmental goods and services do not have a readily available dollar value. And what we need to do then is figure out how to take these significant efforts that are made to monitor different measures in the environment and take those scientific measures and translate them into a number that makes sense to a broader population of people, which is typically dollar terms. And the other thing that this has the advantage of doing, if we're able to monitor measures that are linked to human activities, we can then follow through and say how those measures also are causing dollar losses or dollar gains if we do restoration activities and support or bring in a full analysis of why we might not want to do something that's going to have negative environmental consequences. So how can we use those measures, as I've mentioned, that we've collected from an environment to inform our estimates of value and what people think of as valuable in dollar terms? So what I wanted to kind of go over broadly here was, in economics, a lot of time we think about different types of capital. And you all have heard of capital, I'm sure. And the benefit of capital is that it's something that is used generally. Capital is used as an input into a production process. So a lot of times we think about physical capital in terms of machines and equipment and those kinds of things that we use to produce goods, right? We know what we need. We need to have some kind of factory that's able to produce televisions, for example. We also need human capital in that we need to educate people to be able to use the machines that can produce the goods and services that we like to have in our economy, or to provide the services that we like to have in our economy. Then there's social capital, which, and by the way, these definitions can be a little bit fluid sometimes as to how people define them. But social capital is kind of those relationships between people and the values that people place on those relationships. So you build up that as an asset, right? How I relate to you, what we know about each other is some kind of social capital that can be used to generate some kind of benefits in the future potentially. And the last one here, and not ranked in order of importance, right, is natural capital. And what that is nature, right, and environment, and the asset base of nature. And what's interesting is that in recent years, there's been a lot more effort, I think, to try and figure out how we're going to take natural capital as an asset and view it as an input into the production of goods and services. So that's really how this all is framed here, is natural capital provides the ecological production functions that are inputs into production of goods and services that people enjoy. And the important thing to note here is they're not exclusive of one another. So natural capital might provide certain inputs that then are combined with physical capital to give us things that are important to us. I'll go a little bit more into detail of what I mean by that in a little bit later. So I won't read through all of this definition here because you all can take a look. But basically, this is how UK DEFRA has, they had a committee on natural capital, and they've worked to try and figure out what exactly do we mean by natural capital. And the reason for that is there's a lot of interest in trying to take natural capital and incorporate it into measures of progress and measures of well-being among countries. Right now, you all probably heard of GDP and gross domestic product, and that's used a lot to determine how countries are doing relative to one another. And the idea is here, if we can make natural capital something that we view as a productive an important part of any economy, we then can use that to also compare with GDP as a measure for, or adjust GDP for measuring how countries are faring against one another. And that brings me into what are some limitations of GDP. So the thing we know about GDP is it's used a lot, and it can be a good way of looking at how the economy is doing, right? And to be fair, in the system of national accounts, which is used as the basis for compiling the accounts that lead into GDP, they do not anywhere in there say, in fact, they make the point that it's not meant to be a measure of well-being. So it's not meant to tell us how well we're doing as society overall. It's really just a measure of all the transactions that are going on in the economy and how economically we're performing relative to other countries, and if there's, if we have a recession, if it looks like the economy is growing, what decisions can people make based on that? The problem is that activities that might increase GDP actually can have negative environmental consequences, right? So if there is a storm that's a result of increasing frequency of storms from climate change, the repairs from that storm, the activity that's undertaken in order to fix the damage from that storm would all increase GDP, but it would be tough to say that that storm is something that necessarily has increased the well-being of people who are in that community that's now more vulnerable to those storms happening more frequently. And that's just one example of how this happens. Another is when we do a lot of these extractive resources, we're taking things out of natural capital stocks, the use of them and the purchase of them is included as a measure in GDP, but the degradation, the loss of those for future generations is not included in the GDP measures. So really, a lot of what I'm talking about here with going from this ecosystem condition to getting prices is to try and move toward that idea of making natural capital have a value that can then be incorporated into something like GDP. Now, GDP has been around for about 60 years or so, 60, 70 years. And so it's taken a long time to get to an accounting system that actually, and it's constantly revised, for economic goods and services. So getting there for environmental services is probably going to take at least as long a time, especially because there's a lot of more complicated things that are going on in nature. So what I wanted to show is the Inclusive Wealth Report that the United Nations Environment Program came out with, looked at how so what they were trying to do with inclusive wealth is to include things that are left out of GDP. So things like social capital, things like human capital, and natural capital. And they wanted to try and compare, if we then took those capital measures, those other capital measures into account, how would we be doing in terms of performance among countries? And I think, unfortunately, sorry, you can't see this too well, the different countries, but what you can see is this green bar here, and that is the trend in natural capital. And so as you can see, for a lot of countries, even though from produced capital, which forms the majority of GDP, you see these increasing numbers over time. This is over a 20-year time frame in terms of percentage terms, but in change of capital stocks. But for natural capital, you'd see this decline. And the reason that's interesting is then when you go to the next step, they wanted to compare this inclusive wealth index with GDP per capita. And you can see that for some places that they have positive GDP per capita, they might be having a negative inclusive wealth index when you take into account natural capital stocks that are being depleted. And for places that do not go negative, the positive growth rates that they're seeing in terms of GDP are much smaller when you get down to, like we'll look at Canada here, right? It goes from a GDP per capita of 1.6% over this period to 0.4%, so in inclusive wealth terms. And the reason that's important is if we're thinking about sustainability and how long we're able to maintain certain levels of growth and consumption, if we're using GDP, it may be misleading because what we're actually doing to fuel that growth in GDP is extract natural capital that might, which therefore would mean a lower level of growth might be more sustainable in the long run. Of course, not a resolved issue, but this is one of the things that they're trying to do to compare. And this index in the middle is a human development index, and actually that tries to bring in more of the social, it's another index that has been developed. And the difference between these two is it really doesn't bring in natural capital as much, so that's why you don't see as much of the negative impacts that's going here. Because it's not surprising when you look at some of these countries where you do have the negative impacts, there are a lot of countries that are involved in extractive industries, in oil, fisheries, all these kinds of things. So what do we mean when we say, back to ecosystem conditions? That's the big picture, the macro level, right? What we're going to try and get to at the end of the day if everything works out. And the initial steps, what do we mean when we talk about ecosystem conditions? So there are different ways we can talk about this and describe it, but really it's a way of thinking about what is the ecosystem composed of? What are these characteristics of the ecosystem that give us a sense of the health or overall quality of the ecosystem asset or capital stock, right? And this is framing it again in this context of ecosystems as being an asset, as something that produces value for people. And the measure of condition can be a range of different characteristics that tell us how that asset is doing, right? And this could be, if you think about performance indicators for stocks or for oil, right? You can think that people have these kinds of measures of, well, what is the condition of the company that I'm deciding to invest in or not over the long run? How is it going to perform? And the flows that I would expect to get out of that company will differ depending on the quality of it, right? The quality of the people it has working in it, the quality of the people running it. And this is just a similar way of trying to think of how are the different processes that are going on within an ecosystem influencing the quality of that asset, and how do changes in that condition change the quality of the asset over time. And some of the potential measures that have been discussed and that some of you will be aware of for ecosystem condition are biodiversity, and maybe mean species abundance, but maybe not. It might not be the best measure. Water quality and quantity, soil nutrient, mineral composition, and then there are composite indices that might be used, in addition to, instead of some of these other measures, habitat suitability index, indices of biotic integrity, and you all are familiar with a lot of these different indices that are out there that you can use to get at what the condition of things are. But one of the challenges that if we're trying to get to economic values, we need to think through, because we can't measure everything we might want to in the environment, how do we use the things we're measuring, and how do we decide what we might be measuring in a way that makes it relevant to people who are making decisions based on those measures in an economic sense, right? So how do we have measures that are also meaningful to people so that when you describe it to someone, they know what you're saying when you mean a biotic integrity index is changing? Is that something that can be easily explained to someone who is not familiar with science, to let them know what the state of the asset is and therefore what value they might place on it? So That's ecosystem condition. Now, ecosystem services, there are a bunch of different definitions out there. I'm just going to bring up the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment definition here, which was this kind of intergovernmental, multi-stakeholder effort that was done globally back in the 2000s to look at how ecosystem services are doing over time. And there are problems with what they list as being ecosystem services in some ways, which we'll get to in a second. But they really define ecosystem services as the benefits people obtain from an ecosystem. And I want to be clear here that when we talk about economic values, right, we're talking about things in a very human-centered way. So that is why this is a very human-centered definition, right? This is not about the value that birds may have for a habitat being in a certain condition. It's the value people would have for the birds that are able to thrive in a habitat that might have a better condition than another condition, right? So that needs to be clear. And then we need to think of how the measures we have for condition are linked to the ecosystem services that are generated. And because the state of the assets, right, as an asset base, it's producing flows, and those flows that come out are the ecosystem services. And so as that condition changes, we would expect the flows that come out of that ecosystem to change as well. And so this is just a little schematic to kind of think through these pieces I've talked of. So we have this asset, which is this natural capital base, right? No, I think I lost my thing. But the ecosystem asset is a natural capital base, and that produces a flow of ecosystem services. And those services lead to benefits. The services may be benefits in and of themselves, but a lot of times if we think of things that come from an ecosystem, there's some kind of human-produced input that's also combined in order to get to a benefit. And those benefits lead to improvements in well-being for people, however you might define well-being. And I'll get to a more clear example there in a second. So economic value, just so we can, now we've talked about the ecosystem side a little bit, the economic side. Economic value is more than just we pay for something, but it also includes this idea of what we would be willing to pay for something. So you might know that if you go and buy a television in the market, you'd like to get the price of $150, but you know that if pressed, you would, or you couldn't find it for $150, you would pay $180 or $200. I guess that's a pretty cheap television, actually. But at any rate, maybe $500, $400, something like that. Okay. So we're familiar with doing that, right? We can go out and we can do that and make those trades and make those decisions with goods that are out in the market. The different features of that television, right, would determine how much we're willing to pay for it. If it has a smart TV, if it's internet capable, then we might pay more for it than a TV that is really tiny and doesn't have any availability to go online or link to the internet. So those different features and attributes of the television are important for our values and how our maximum willingness to pay for them. In the same way, we need to figure out a way to do that for ecosystems, right? Coming from it, from this human-centered focus, to get at values, right, in dollar terms, how do we look at the attributes that are associated with ecosystems and put those attributes into dollar terms, right? How do we take a set of different pieces of an asset and then say this is what the value is for it by describing it to someone and having them indicate their value? And that's the challenge in non-market valuation. So there's a bunch of different approaches. I'm not going to go over all of them today. There's revealed preference, which is, I'll go through the examples of that. And these are things where people show you their preference through actions they engage in. And usually these are actions that have a proxy, a market proxy, right? So there's something going on in like an economic transaction that we can use to indicate their value for an environmental resource. And one of the big ones there is the travel cost method, which I'll talk about in a second. Stated preference, some of you may have heard of these. These are continued valuation surveys. These are good ways of getting at situations that might not exist. So they're ways of saying, if I completed a restoration project, would you be willing to pay $5 extra per year in taxes to support that restoration project? And you ask a lot of people this, and you vary the price amount, and you see at what price people start saying no, because people should have a budget constraint, and if you don't see any no's, you're probably either not pricing it too high or there's something wrong with your survey, because we know that you should stop paying when people should believe they should have to pay this, so therefore they shouldn't be indicating they would give up all their wealth for something unless, at least most people shouldn't, unless they really do love the environment that much. And the last one of these broad categories here is benefit transfer, and that's when we take a value that's generated from primary study in one area, so someone has done a revealed preference or stated preference type study, and transfer it to another similar habitat. And there was a paper by Costanza in Science a while back that looked at ecosystem service values for the whole world, and really they used benefit transfer where they just multiplied the areas of habitat times values in some areas to get an idea of what the total value of ecosystem services the world over was worth. And there are challenges with that kind of an approach from an economic perspective. So what we're talking about here in terms of willingness to pay is the consumer surplus area. And what we want to do is construct a demand curve. So with all of these methods, right, you've all heard of demand curves, I think, probably, from economics. So we have those things for televisions, right? We need to construct a demand curve for ecosystem goods and services in order to do this economic analysis. And so it's what is the price and what is the quantity and what's the shape of all these things and how does that green area change? And the reason the green area is important is at the top of that area here where the demand curve intersects the price curve is something we call the maximum willingness to pay. So that's the most that anyone in the population is willing to pay for something. That dashed line is the price that actually is demanded in the market. So that area below the demand curve and above the price line is called our consumer surplus. So that's the advantage that people get from not having to pay as much as they would have, right? So that's money that they have that they can either use for other things or save or do whatever they want with. And as you shift that demand curve or change the price, you change the consumer surplus. So if we ended up with a recreational site and we wanted to estimate, and we knew it was, right now it costs $5 to go in, if we increase the price to $10, we could try and figure out what the change in consumer surplus is and what the economic value change is for people going to that site. And we could ask people what they would do under different situations, or observe what they're doing under different situations of price, and use that as a proxy for what their value for the environmental service is. We could also change the quality of the asset and shift that demand curve around, which would obviously change the size of the green area that's there. And this really is a welfare measure that is how is society's welfare changing from those kinds of changes in price and changes in demand. And it's important to note that one of the challenges for getting this into GDP is that GDP does not include welfare measure changes. It does not include consumer surplus changes, right? It's just market transactions. And market transactions are just market prices, which do not include this welfare kind of component. So that's one of the challenges of finding methods that are most consistent with that when you're trying to adjust GDP. So if we're talking about people, and we're talking about how they have a willingness to pay, beneficiaries are important here, right? All of these ecosystems, and you all know, different ecosystems have different groups of beneficiaries, sometimes multiple groups of beneficiaries, who view the ecosystem in a different way and get different services, uses out of them, right? So those differing preferences that people have for services means that their demand curve will be different, and means that they will have different values that they place on it. And so it's important when we're doing any kind of valuation exercise to think about the population we're looking at and make sure that we're being clear that this is the value that it could be the overall population, so this is the overall population, or this is the value that fishermen place on this resource. This is the value that recreationists place on this resource. What your limits are to the value that you're constructing, that it might not be the entire value for the resource. And then you have to decide on what ecosystem condition measures you need to use, because those measures should reflect not just the current uses of the environment, but you should be thinking about in the future, what are the potential uses of this area, and therefore, what might I want to track over time as the uses change over time. And one of the most important things here is that we are estimating the economic value at the correct point in the chain. And that's that chain, right, from ecosystem functions through to the condition of the ecosystem to the ecosystem services. So where am I assessing the value? And the reason is we want to differentiate between something that's intermediate and something that's these final services and benefits. And depending on the beneficiary category, those final services may differ. But what we want to make sure we're doing is, if we're interested in the benefit to recreational anglers, right, we don't want to be valuing both the water quality. We don't want to ask them what the value of the water quality is, get a value for that, and then estimate what the value of the population of fish that they're getting is. Because if we add those two values together, then we're double counting. Because from the perspective of the fishermen, the value of the bass population is what they're getting out of it. And that population has embedded within it the water quality. So the water quality value is the water quality condition is a part of the end service that they get out of it. So this difference between what the final services are, the final interface with people versus what the environment is producing is important for us to keep in mind. For drinking water, to get to the benefit of drinking water, the water quality service actually may be the final service in that case, right? Because we would then use the human inputs that would differ depending on what that water quality is. But if we had water quality that's of great quality for drinking, then that's the service provided by the environment, right? So it's important to keep in mind where we are in the chain so that we're avoiding double counting, and for a framework of thinking where our ecological condition measures fit into linking the processes of the ecosystem to humans. So how does that water quality measure as a measure of condition link? Is it really a great proxy for the actual service that's coming out? Or do we need to move on to the next step and look at the population of fish that are there to really make it resonate with the community of people we're interested in from a beneficiary perspective? So this is what the Environmental Protection Agency just released. And I just wanted to briefly mention it here because I think it helps give a little more perspective on what I'm talking about. It's the final ecosystem goods and services. And this is this idea that you want to be at the last part of the interaction of humans with the environment. So we have this flow, right, from the environment to human well-being that I talked about and showed in that other diagram. And there's an ecological production function that produces something. And then there's an economic production function that takes that something and turns it into something that has total economic value. And the way they see it is that this final ecosystem goods and services lies at that as close as you can be to that transition point between the ecological production and the economic production. And in that way, you're isolating as much of the value that's from the environment from anything that humans may be bringing in from a manufactured point of view, so that you're really seeing what the value of the environmental good and service is. And within the ecological production function, we have these processes and functions which are related to the ecosystem condition. And within the economic production function, we have labor and capital goods, right? So this is the idea that when you have a recreation site, for example, yes, it's good to have good water quality, but one of the things we need to keep in mind is that people would not be coming to a lot of recreation sites if there were not roads to get them there, if there were not facilities at the recreation site. So the benefit that people get, that trip, that day at the beach, right, is comprised of both the ecological production function and the economic production function. And it doesn't mean that you're always able to isolate things perfectly, but at least you need to keep in mind that these different aspects are coming into the production of the final benefit. And this is what's really neat that they've done too, is they've tried to develop a classification structure for beneficiaries to ecosystem services. And the way they've done this, I won't go into an excruciating detail here, is they have the environment, so a class and subclass of the environment, so aquatic, terrestrial, and then on the other side they have a beneficiary class. So are these terrestrial forests, right? And people who are benefiting in this case are recreational hunters. And this is just a way, what they're really trying to do is, if we need to move toward a accounting framework, right, a GDP kind of framework for environmental goods and services, we need to be more rigorous in thinking about how the environment is providing something that people are using if we want to incorporate it into these measures. Because otherwise it's not going to be believable, right? So we need to have a classification system that's consistent, that people are using across researchers, across governments, in order to understand what people are actually getting out of the environment. And this is just released last year, so it's a work in progress. But I think it's really going to be interesting to try and apply it in different areas around the country. And now I want to go through a few examples of where I've worked on trying to link these kinds of things. The first one is tourism development, and I did some work in Croatia looking at the question of tourism development and how does that impact water quality and people's values for the environment. And Croatia, for good reason, has focused on tourism development as a means of increasing our GDP, right? So countries are always focused on trying to increase GDP, and in this case, tourism development makes sense there because they have beautiful beaches, they have pretty pristine water quality in most places, and they're a destination that people view as being relatively untouched because they had war, et cetera, so people didn't go there. But now people are, you all probably heard more recently that Croatia has become a much more popular tourism destination. So they wanted to increase by something like 50% the contribution to GDP of the tourism industry, which is a lot. But the problem is, for Croatia, and for other countries actually, where they're considering these kinds of things, is that development of tourism brings a bunch of different problems, one of which is increased wastewater. And they're building hotels, they're building, not even hotels, but kind of people are building houses to rent out to people when they're coming and staying. The challenge is that in Croatia at the time I was doing this, and even now, there's limited wastewater treatment, and even where it is present, they've built great wastewater treatment facilities, but people don't want to connect to the wastewater treatment facility. So you have pipes that basically run out from houses and run out right into the water. So that it goes into these bays, and that obviously can cause a lot of problems when you have a lot of people doing that. And in other places, we had seen that water quality impacts the value of beach visits. So I was kind of trying to look at how is tourism development going to impact people's propensity to visit a destination. So this is Croatia, for those of you who aren't familiar. So there's the Adriatic. It makes it a very tempting place to visit. Most of the work I'm going to talk about here was done down around Split, and in the bay, there's a outfall that goes out way out into the Adriatic now that they have, but there's a bay right there called Castella Bay that has all of these, or still probably has a lot of them, these informal kind of pipes that went out into the bay, which made things not so good for water quality. So this is what the economic model looks like, and I just kind of tried to show this visually. It basically takes total coliform levels, from a ecological model, very simple ecological model, and then shows how those evolve over time, and that figures into people's preferences for visiting a different recreational site. And the method that I used here is called the travel cost method. So you see there's a travel cost coefficient, there's travel time, et cetera, and basically what this is doing is trying to get at a predicted probability of people choosing one beach location versus another. So you look at a range of different beaches. You can do this for any kinds of recreational sites, and look at the utility they get out of that visit. And the utility is composed of how much they paid to get there, the characteristics of the site they're visiting, and you then figure out, based on that, and the expected value they have for that one site compared to the expected value of all of the sites, what is the predicted probability of them choosing one site versus another. And as you change the characteristics of the sites, what happens is, in the model, it resorts people, right? So if I have a site that improves in water quality, that may become someone's more preferred site to visit. So they will choose to leave the site they were visiting and reallocate their visit to that location, which may mean an increase in travel costs, which means that the value that they have for that site has increased, right? So there's this interplay of changes in the ecosystem condition measure, which is this water quality measure, and changes in the value people place on it based on the measure. And what we can then look at is this measure that's very similar to consumer surplus. I won't go into the details into how it's a little different, but we basically look at the utility in the water quality, the new water quality situation, right? So how much benefit they're getting from the set of sites they could have chosen from in the new water quality situation. and then compare that to the benefits they were getting in the old water quality situation and see if overall do we have a positive increase in economic value from that water quality change. And the way we turn it into monetary terms is that beta at the end is the travel cost. So you've compiled from all of these people the travel cost that it would what it would cost them basically to get one way from, or round trip, you could do either way, from each from their home location to the destinations. And so by having that parameter in there, you're able to monetize the utility that they get from picking one site or another. And so just in consumer surplus terms, just to quickly mention what, I think this might make more sense in this way. If you have, drive 75 miles, you have some people who are willing to drive 75 miles to get to a site. So then the trip must be worth at least $150. So if we're looking back at that consumer surplus graph, right, we might be up here to set the highest point on it. Now you might have some other people who travel only 25 miles, but when you do the analysis, they might actually have been, as part of the population, there are people in the population who are willing to pay more, so the consumer surplus for a given quantity of trips is higher. So there's this change in consumer surplus that we can use to evaluate how much value people place on recreation sites. And the ecological model, I will not go into detail here, but basically it just looked at very simple precipitation, number of people, and how that might change over time. And so the results were that the coliform count did predict people's decisions, not surprisingly, I guess, as to which beach they were choosing. And what was interesting is there were population, blue flag was not significant in predicting where people went. The blue flag is an indicator of it being a great beach, basically. And the count dummies that are down there were interesting because, so you have a population of users, right? And this is why it's important to keep in mind who's using the resource. They were both Croatians and then non-locals. And what it turned out to be the case was local Croatians didn't have as much of a negative response to the coliform count as tourists did. So tourists were making their decisions based on the coliform count that's going on or the water quality, right? Whereas people from local areas weren't making their decisions based on that. And that's been found in other areas where people just tend to visit places they're familiar with. And they visit the places they've traditionally gone to. And when I talk to people out there, they would say, oh, well, we've come here a lot. We know the water quality is bad, but we've never gotten sick. So I think, and we just like coming here because this is where our family always comes. And that does make sense from that perspective. What's also interesting, though, is there's this water quality dummy that was available. And for those people who were informed that the Croatian Ministry of Environment released this report on percentage of samples that are water quality 2, and they have the environmental ministry basically says, is it 1, 2, 3, or 4? 1 is the highest, 2 is the next, is not so good. So people who were aware of that, who were Croatians and locals, and were able to read this, right, because it's in Croatian, did have a negative response to that kind of a report. So what's also important for us to think about when we're talking about measures of ecosystem condition and the stuff we're doing when we're monitoring environmental condition is, how is that information being used in the next step in informing the public, right? Is it getting out there to people who are able to use it to make decisions or not, right? And the linked model here used those economic decisions of people, so how they're sorting themselves across beaches to try and figure out what is the value they place on a water quality improvement. And what I looked at was improving the water quality on the worst water quality beach, so it's the most extreme situation, right, as one of the scenarios. And turned out that people would be willing to pay 40 euros for improvement of 25% on the worst quality beach. And now that's how you would do this in like a revealed preference context. If you were doing this in a survey contingent evaluation context, you would actually just ask people, if I put a program in place to improve water quality by 50%, what would you be willing to pay? It's not as simple as that, but That's the general idea. And they would indicate if they would be willing to pay $25, $30, 25 euros or more, kind of thing. So that's one example I want to talk about. Go through here. Natural resource damage assessment process, the work I have done at NOAA, which looks at how you compensate for things like oil spill and hazardous waste site contamination. And in the regulations that are present, the great thing about the Oil Pollution Act regulations is they explicitly talk about the need to compensate for both ecological and human use services. Now, their ecological services there, interestingly and importantly, are defined slightly differently than what we've talked about for ecosystem services. They do not focus, when they talk about these ecological services, on just the services to humans. They're also the benefits that one receptor, one organism might provide to another, and that gets to a broader sense of, it makes it challenging to think of how you can talk about services in that way, but it also is obviously a different way of thinking about it than just saying, these are the services humans get, period, and that's it, right? And then they break out human use services separately, so these are the recreation type services, or the value I might place on knowing an environment is in a given situation. And they use some approaches, primarily for ecological losses, something called habitat equivalency analysis, which we could talk for a long time about, to try and figure out how much restoration you should do for an injury that occurs in a given area. And basically it's trying to say this number of acres compensates the public for this number of acres of wetland that were lost from an oil spill or a hazardous waste release. Now for recreational losses, it's a little different. What you often will do, it's a lot different actually, you'll quantify the economic value that's lost, so you'll use something like a travel cost method, and then figure out, so what are the lost trips? How many trips did I lose because I had a contamination at a certain level? And then decide, it would be great to be able to then value the restoration project as well and say how many trips will that bring back. The challenge is, for a lot of situations where you don't have a huge amount of money available, that gets very expensive. So a lot of times they'll just use the cost of the restoration project as a proxy for value, which has its own limitations. And then you make that cost equivalent to what your economic value lost is, right? So if I lost $100 million in recreational trips, then I would spend $100 million on a restoration project that brings back that element of value. And so I just want to talk about the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River had challenges with PCB contamination, and there were fish consumption advisories, right? So this is our measure of condition, is our fish consumption, presence of fish consumption advisories tells the population something about how the ecosystem is doing. And what we wanted to find out was, how do anglers respond to that information on fish consumption advisories? So a survey is used to collect characteristics of the trips from anglers in these counties along the St. Lawrence, so Clinton, Franklin, St. Lawrence, Jefferson, and Lewis. And then what you also needed, right, are the site characteristics of the places people are going to fish, right? Because they're going to be different. Some are going to have great boat ramps, some are going to have restrooms, while others might be a really informal location that people drop their boat into the water, right? So it's important to know what those locations look like, because those, right, as attributes of value, those things will change what the value is. You want to be able to isolate that effect from the effect of the fish consumption advisory, right? So a really great site might have a lot of people that go to it, even if the fish consumption advisory is worse near that site than near a really rickety site that's further away, right? And so this is the way the results look, and the results showed that for improvements in catch, you ended up with this positive value that people place in, which is not surprising, right? Places they had expected a higher catch rate, they would be willing to pay more to travel to, take more trips to. What's important here for our purposes is this fish advisory parameter estimate, which, as you see, is negative and significant. And so what it's telling us is that the fish advisory is causing a negative impact on the number of trips that people are deciding to take to locations. And so through that behavioral analysis, you're able to say about 220,000 lost trips. And so then the next step is, okay, what can I do to bring back those lost trips to the population that has been affected along the St. Lawrence River? And that's what they've done in the proposed restoration plan for the St. Lawrence River in terms of creating additional boat ramps and recreation sites. So the last thing I'll go through here really quickly is there aren't a lot of studies that have been done about urban restoration, and unfortunately, when you go out and look in the literature for economic stuff, from an economic perspective, when you look at those studies, you don't find a lot of talking about what values having a park in creating a park in the middle of an urban area generates for people. A lot of things talk about the values that people get from these very pristine parks that are located far from urban centers. So what's really interesting to me is to try and figure out how do people who live in urban areas value the environment within urban areas and also their relationship with the environment outside, right? Because those service flows aren't stuck. Those service flows can be coming into urban areas from areas that are located off-site. And one thing I worked on was in Huntington Beach out in California, and what that looked at was biophysical changes. So how do you have these biophysical changes from restoration in terms of carbon sequestered, aesthetic improvements, and improvements in habitat connectivity and biodiversity, and how do people value that? And if you run this through a model, what you find out is that in terms of carbon storage, you have a value of 130,000, and in terms of acres restored, if you run it through something called a hedonic analysis, right, you have an increase in property values of 36 million, which is a significant chunk of change. Right? And what's important, though, is in order to do this kind of work, you need to have monitoring of restoration that goes on after the restoration project is complete. And a lot of times, both in ecological terms and certainly in economic terms, restoration monitoring doesn't go out for very long after the project is actually finished. Because in order to see that uplift it has for people and that benefit it produces for people, you need to be able to track it over time. So down the road, what do I think would be great? So I think having some kind of accounting system for ecosystems on Long Island would be really interesting, even if you started at a county level and trying to figure out what are the ecosystems that are out there and how can we try and put some rigor on thinking about how do they benefit people, where are those beneficiaries located, maybe try and use the EPA system to do that, make that linkage. And then tracking that over time, right? See how you're doing with those measures in an area like Long Island compared to economic measures on Long Island in terms of growth and economic improvement. So these price signals that are generated, right? So we're generating a price from all of this, should help tell us something about the status of ecosystems. Are people's values for the ecosystem changing, and does that reflect something we should be concerned about? Is there a change in condition that is leading to a change in value? And what I think would be really neat is looking at this idea of resilience, and can you price resilience, ecosystem resilience in a way that makes sense to people, so that you're putting a value on the insurance policy that nature provides to us by being resilient, by being able to bounce back from things before we get past a threshold or into an alternate state, which that alternate state might provide ecosystem services that are different and not preferred by people, right? So one thing here is, how far are we from a water quality threshold where people stop going to a certain destination, right? We have these beaches and they're great and they're generating a lot of value, both in non-monetary and monetary terms, but if we pass a threshold, those beaches may not be, people might start going elsewhere. And how close are we based on what values we're seeing? And there's some resilience literature, which I won't go over here, but they've looked at trying to use these measures of condition of the ecosystem in terms of tree density and how that tree density changes as a way of trying to price the resilience measure. And water tables were used in Australia. So the higher the water table gets, the worse it is for those crops because they get exposed to salinity. And how can you use, so that deeper water table is a measure of the resilience, the stock of resilience. So I'll wrap up there because I think we're getting close to time here. But I think these are some of the questions, and I've gone over most of these, so it'd be good to get at them all.
Well, you can't ask your own questions. Are there other questions?
So, if you look at the effect of Hurricane Sandy on local communities and people that want to live right by beach. So you have an economic benefit from restoring their homes and services and all that. But how do you balance that, or who decides how that balances against the greater good, or what price do you put on never putting any of that infrastructure, or letting those people live right against the ocean because of the benefit to the rest of society and people that would use it in a different way?
Well, I think the problem there is, I think the challenge there is in a lot of cases, you want to make sure the incentives are correct in economic terms. We're talking about efficient economics, right? Is that if you want people to live in coastal areas, you should do things like not have them bear the full cost of living right along the coast, right? So you might subsidize flood insurance, you might subsidize things like that. If you, in economic terms, wanted to make it be that people made decisions based on incurring all the costs and not social, having costs that are bared by other people, then you wouldn't encourage those kinds of approaches, right? So I guess the way you make the trade-off is you could bring in ecosystem values in a sense of, if we didn't have these structures here, how might it allow for the habitat to adjust to changes in sea level rise? But you could also bring in, just from an economic perspective, what are the costs that are borne by communities for trying to, over the long run, sustain areas that might not make sense economically, right? I mean, in the Netherlands, right, a lot of places now in the Netherlands have decided there are areas that they would just let flood, right? And so they're making plans that these are areas that will flood. It doesn't make economic sense to have people living there. How do we do that? But it's a harder sell. And this is the challenge, right? These are places people have a value for a historical reason, right? They've lived there. They have a link to that community. So it gets beyond, I guess, pure dollars and cents is the challenge with those kinds of things.
Has anyone tried to hindcast these analyses, say back 150 years, to look at how perhaps natural resource valuation has changed over time?
Not that I'm aware of. I think the challenge is that we don't have, a lot of this relies on having data on people's behavior, and we just don't have a lot of data that goes back too far. Even for things like recreation, it's spotty to try and figure out how many people are going to X, Y, or Z location. So I think there haven't been a lot of backward analyses of how things have changed. Now, what you could try and, you'd run the risk that people's values change over time, right? The population's values for ecosystems change over time, but you could look at changes in the habitat and have a valuation measure of what that change would mean now and try and adjust it backwards for changes in wealth, right? So that, back then people didn't have the same level of wealth, so their value you can adjust that value downward perhaps and use the function to actually, you can tweak the economic function based on the characteristics of the population back in that time. So they're kind of like benefit transfer over time rather than over space.
So in the beginning, you had that table which showed the IWI and the GDP. What I noted for Kenya, it was 0.1 and 0.1. What exactly does that mean?
Let's see. So, so if it was 0.1 and 0.1, it might mean either that there isn't a lot of resource extraction going on that is causing a big difference. But they also have there are other things in that inclusive wealth index that maybe if there is resource extraction, might be either decreasing or boosting it one way or the other. So I'd have to look at the different measures, because there's all these other capital measures aside from natural capital that are in there. And so I'm not sure what might mean make it the same.
So, are they normalized though? Would that mean that's like a stable condition?
0.1?
0.1.
Well, no, not necessarily, because you'd have to look at, it depends what your objective is, right? If it's a stable condition or not. Because if it's 0.1 GDP growth, well, that's pretty low GDP growth. in terms of economic terms. And if it's 0.1 otherwise, then, I mean, it could mean that your population, there's a population growth that's negatively impacting the economic growth, right? That sometimes happens where you'll see this, when they bring in the population number, it decreases that inclusive wealth index and the human development index just because those population pressures are increasing. But I'd have to look more at this.
Nothing else? Go, Bob.
I'm really intrigued by how you assign value to something and who assigns those values. And I recall, you're probably too young to recall these sorts of things, but during the Vietnam War, Robert McNamara was a big proponent. He was the Secretary of Defense. He was a big proponent of systems analysis. And the military did an analysis of what the cost of various assets were. And of course, one asset's draftees, the human asset of building the military. But from the military's perspective, that was free. So they had to assign a value to draftees. And McNamara, in his analysis, decided $1 would be that value. And of course, that differs totally from the parents' perspective of the young draftees who would be taken in. And so I'm wondering how, in assigning a value, getting a price quantity map like you showed, who does that? And from whose perspective is it you come up with that?
I think that's the challenge, and that's kind of why when I was talking about these beneficiary issues, it's going to be whoever you're talking to who assigns the value, right? So if your survey is talking to fishermen, that value you get is going to be their value for the resource, which may be very different than someone who has no links to fishing or uses the resource just to see, like they own a home by the water and just are there to see the water. They don't really care too much about what's in the water maybe. So I think that's the important thing to keep in mind with these values is since they are human-centered, they're centered very much on your population that you're surveying. So if you want to have a value that reflects population as a whole in a given area, you need to make sure that you've truly randomly sampled from that population. Otherwise, it'll be skewed one way or another. So it'll be an average value, but it'll be.
So that getting back to Kamazima's question about your table, which is a far more general kind of table, it seems like a very flexible kind of table, perhaps.
Well, yes, and particularly there, they're just starting off with trying to figure out how to put things in the inclusive wealth index. They want to. One of the problems is they don't have a lot of the prices to put in for inclusive wealth, right? They want to broaden out to natural capital, but they don't really know what prices to put there, and so they're using proxies for things in that inclusive wealth table. So I think, yeah, it's
intriguing problem.
Yes, challenging.
Just to follow up that idea of the value of a human life, we had a meeting this morning with the Army Corps of Engineers about rebuilding after Sandy.
Yeah.
And they love to hear sort of quantitative. They often find it hard working with people with ecological concerns because they can't put a dollar value on the ecosystem, and what your work's going to help that. But if you ask the Army Corps, and I've done this, what is the value of a human life? They refuse to tell you because maybe it's what Bob said. They consider it to be zero. I don't know. It's the military. No, but if you talk to the Department of Transportation about designing safer roads, they might say $3 million or even $5 million, or you might talk to EPA. It's probably EPA. They each have their own sort of secret formula.
Yes.
You won't find it on any website that they use in designing activities.
And I know that in some cases they've shied away from it because this getting a value of statistical life, right, has a lot of other values roped into it that they don't want to tread on, right? That you shouldn't be giving people, a value on someone's life, something like that, a dollar value. And which we get, I mean, for environmental stuff, that comes up a lot too, right? That we shouldn't be. This kind of stuff is also can be controversial because people don't like the idea of putting dollar values on nature because then it just turns into another commodity, which is a challenge.
I think we're going to adjourn down to the Kubo room. We're all involved in making lots of observations, and I think these sorts of considerations go in both into justifying making those in the first place and in interpreting the value, the impact of those things in the final case. As you go down to the Kuba room, you'll walk right past Anthony's office, so make note of it. Thank you.
No, this is 75 cents. There was a draft on
We're making it.
Was that the natural disaster had no effect? Because you're going yeah, and you know, so it's very strange how,
Very difficult.
Yeah, but it's all these things that what we had, you know, in our rules or anything else, it's like, you know, the idea of ecosystem services and this, and there's a lot of terminology and there's a lot of thoughts about this, which, you know, programs want us to introduce, and then having something like you is great because anytime we actually have someone who go and argue.
So the next level is solar system services. Let's see sunlight.
Well, I was telling you about going to Columbia with Jenny, where